How's it going, everybody? This is Radish Head and welcome back to Upland Analysis. Today I'm in San Francisco, the Genesis City, a city that everybody knows is something special in Upland, but somewhere that people haven't been talking about so much recently. Lots of city releases in the Midwest and Manhattan and Rutherford have seen lots and lots of price movement, but San Francisco has just kind of been, plugging away in the background. But I think there's evidence to suggest that that might not be the case for so much longer, and I'm going to tell you why in this video. So first of all, let me pull up some data that I've been collecting on San Francisco over the last few weeks, and this top table here is the floor price per collection, and on the bottom here is the markup. So if you're curious, feel free to pause the video and take a look at the data breakdown. But what I really wanted to take a look at was the sunset numbers and the kind of non-collection numbers, right? So over the periods that I've been tracking it, it's been really, really weird. The sunset, a collection area in San Francisco, has pretty much always been tied or lower than the non-collection floor in the city. So even though I know sunset's a fairly big collection, for those of you who don't know whereabouts it is, this is the San Francisco map. Sunset is sort of on the west coast here, and it incorporates this outer Sunset neighborhood and the inner Sunset neighborhood. So it's a pretty large chunk of San Francisco, but it is still a collection. So it was always quite weird to me that it was pretty much consistently the cheapest property in the city, and that is still the case. But the first factor that I think suggests that San Francisco is overdue a little bit of price movement is that back a couple of months ago, San Francisco and Manhattan were both really stable. Manhattan was stable at about 38 to 40,000 UPIX. San Francisco was stable at about 21,000 UPIX, and that was the case for weeks and weeks. I was tracking the data. Now we all know what's happened in Manhattan. There's one player who's been selling a glut of Harlem properties. They all sold out. Word got around that the price was no longer being suppressed in Manhattan, and the price has just shot through the roof, and at the moment we are well above 100,000 floor. I think we're at about 120,000 UPIX floor at the moment, and even though we've had the Bronx announcement, that's shown no sign of collapsing in any meaningful way. On the other hand, in San Francisco, the Bronx announcement has not really changed anything either, but it also hasn't had this upward momentum that we've seen on the East Coast. Prior to that upward movement in Manhattan, the two cities had kind of found a nice floor where San Francisco was always at about 50% of Manhattan, and that kind of made sense to me. They were both tier 1 cities, they both are global iconic cities, and Manhattan was the more expensive of the two because it's arguably a more desirable location, and most importantly, there's a lot fewer properties in Manhattan than there are in San Francisco, and it's on an island, I guess, which also makes it very popular. But if we take that same ratio into account, I think that was a really sensible resting point for those two based on their equal positions as key cities in the Upland metaverse, but the fact that Manhattan is understandably a bit more popular than San Francisco. Well, Manhattan is at 120,000 UPIX floor at the moment, so I see absolutely no reason why people aren't going to look over at San Francisco and go, hey, actually, for the level of popularity of this city and the fact that it is the Genesis City where everything's going to be happening in the future. Remember, and actually you may not know this, but San Francisco was the first city in Upland, and the developers have said, and they've stuck to this so far, that every new feature in the game is going to be launched into San Francisco first. So Spark was added into San Francisco first. We can expect to see businesses added to San Francisco first. Cars will be in San Francisco first. If you are in Upland for the gameplay experience, I feel like you have to own a few properties in San Francisco, and word is going to get around that is the case, because it's been a little bit of time since any major new features were added to the game in the vein of like Spark or constructing buildings. But if we do get meta ventures in the next couple of months, and they're limited to San Francisco only for the start, you better believe that is going to drive some people to buy up San Francisco properties. It's going to happen. Now, that is one trigger that could set off San Francisco in kind of reaching that 50% of Manhattan equilibrium, which is roughly double the price that it's currently sitting at now. So I'm buying up in Sunset at the moment because I think that the fair value right now for properties in Sunset is roughly double what they are now. I've got absolutely no issue paying 25,000 UPX for properties in Sunset. Another factor which I think is really interesting to talk about, it actually reminds me very much of what we saw happening in Manhattan. In Manhattan, the price was kind of suppressed at 40,000 because there was one player who had hundreds of Harlem properties, collection properties, and he was a very early player into the game. He pretty much minted all of Harlem, and he was just listing them at about 38 to 40,000. So that was just holding the price. There was a hard ceiling on what that floor could be until people could punch through and buy all those Harlem properties. It was stuck at 38 to 40, and actually pretty much within days of all of those Harlem properties being bought up, that triggered that upward momentum which we're seeing right now in Manhattan. There's actually something really similar happening in San Francisco that I don't think I've seen many people talk about. There's a user called Dragon Goat, I believe, and he had hundreds and hundreds of Sunset properties, again a collection area in a tier 1 city, sort of like Harlem in Manhattan, and he was listing them all for US dollars at around $16 per property, and he had hundreds of them. And people have been slowly sort of striking away at these $16 Sunset properties, and I think he might have just run out of them, because I've been looking at the market today and yesterday and I haven't seen him list any more of them. So if it's true that he's no longer holding the price down at, it was $16, which was roughly equivalent to 22,000 UPX. So people weren't selling for more than 22,000 UPX because this Dragon Goat guy had all of these Sunset properties. If he's run out, that's just like the Harlem guy running out of stuff in Manhattan. There's just, the sky's the limit. We're gonna go into price discovery territory. I think there's a really good possibility of that. And the third factor is, of course, the Build Up Sunset competition currently being held by Kaiser 12 and DJ Shorts. If you're not aware of this competition, I'm going to have a link to it in the description. I'm just going to flag up the video real quick. I won't play anything, but the basic gist of it is you get properties in the Sunset collection in San Francisco, and then from December the 4th, which was yesterday, until January the 9th, as people start to complete structures like townhouses on their properties in Sunset, that's going to build up a prize pool, and they're going to be gifting out thousands of UPX to players who are building in the Sunset neighborhood right now. And I know for a fact this is already having an impact, because I've sold 2 structure properties in Sunset since this competition was announced, both considerably higher than what I'd usually be selling Sunset structure properties for. They were at 70 and 75,000 UPX I sold them for. Previously, I'd struggled to sell any of them for more than 60,000. So clearly, it's already given people some notice of San Francisco and the Sunset neighborhood. And I think it's so fantastic they're doing this event, and I seriously would highly recommend that you check out Kaiser 12 and DJ Shorts' channel. And absolutely, if you can, if you've got properties in Sunset and you've got Spark, I would be 100% building properties up in Sunset right now, because I think they've identified the same thing as me, that it's a little bit weird that the Sunset Collection floor is pretty much tied with the San Francisco floor. I think this event could go some way to pushing up the value of properties in Sunset and San Francisco as a whole. I really do. And I'm going to be tracking that. So you can see on this chart here, I'm tracking the cheapest floor and the most expensive floor over time. And this black line here was when the Build Up Sunset competition was launched. You can see that it's already had an impact. I mean, not much data to go off. It might be a bit early to say that this is purely due to the Build Up Sunset competition. Could be due to the other two factors that I listed earlier. It's interesting though, in one day it's gone up by more than 1,000, and actually the I've put here that it's 28,400 for Sunset. I bet if I sort of zoom in on Sunset now, I'm not going to capture it all in one go, but I reckon it'll be more than 28,400, because I think people are sort of buying up the floor. There you go. There's one at 28,800, and then immediately 29,500. In fact, you know what? I'm gonna put my money where my mouth is. I think 28,800. It's surrounded by dollar value properties rather than UpX value ones. So that's usually a good indicator that it's pretty cheap. So there you go. I've instantly pushed the floor up to 29,000 and something. So I'll be tracking that data over the coming days, and I'm really planning on seeing if this Build Up Sunset competition, combined with the relationship with Manhattan prices and the fact that Dragon Goat has run out, supposedly, of cheap Sunset properties, will all of those three things combined lead to some kind of San Franciscan renaissance? I don't know for sure, but I think there's a good chance. So you heard it here first. If in the next few weeks San Francisco starts to rocket up to 50, 60k, you're welcome. But yeah, that's going to be really interesting to see. So certainly by the end of the Build Up Sunset contest on the 9th of January, I'm going to do another video, and we're going to assess the impact of it, because that's an entirely community-driven event. There's no input from the staff at Upland at all. It's completely been organised by these two players, and they've sourced all of the prize funds. So if that can have an impact on the floor price in San Francisco and the Sunset neighborhood, I think that's a fantastic thing for Uplands, and that's a really, really good case study for what similar events could be in the future, which I think is really cool. So if you enjoyed that little bit of analysis and you want to keep up to date on the goings on in San Francisco and elsewhere in the metaverse, I'd love it if you subscribed to the channel and gave this video a like. But until next time, I'll see you then.